And thank you for your time today.
My pleasure, really nice to meet you.
Jonathan, to start with, a little bit about yourself. You were born in Brisbane, you've been educated here, so you've grown up here. Tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so I was born and raised in Brisbane, grew up in Chermside on the north side in the suburbs. My mum's a white Australian. She, I think, was originally born in Nambour and kind of a Brisbane girl. And my father's from Sri Lanka, so he's a Tamil man, and he left when the civil war started a couple of decades ago. So I kind of grew up in Brisbane having a bit of a mixed identity, sort of feeling like I was an immigrant or not quite belonging to Australia, but also not really feeling Sri Lankan.
I know the feeling.
So I grew up with a bit of that identity crisis, and I think that was part of what contributed to me having an interest in politics and social change, because I experienced a bit of racism growing up and also saw the way my father was treated sometimes, and I think that that insight perhaps politicised me a little bit. So went to UQ at St Lucia and studied law and journalism and Aboriginal studies, and then ended up finding my way here.
So what was it, what influenced you to go into politics?
So apart from my background, I spent a little bit of time in remote Aboriginal communities in the Northern Territory. My mum was a teacher up there at times, and seeing those communities and the oppression and the disadvantage and the kind of the standard of living for Aboriginal people in some of those communities, it was so far behind what I'd seen in suburban Brisbane, and I thought, this is completely unjust. I also got quite active around sort of refugee rights issues, and I remember even in high school going along to some of the protests when John Howard was turning back the boats and all that sort of stuff was starting. So I guess feeling very frustrated about the way politics was going, and I think I was always quite, I guess you'd say, progressive, or had those sorts of values, and eventually started following the Greens because I thought that their policies lined up most with what I believed in.
With what you believed in.
Yeah.
So the personal question, you are a musician and a beat poet. What on earth is a beat poet?
Yeah, I think the term beat poet's a bit of an old one. Some people would call it like a slam poet or just a spoken word artist, and that's, I guess, poetry that doesn't always have a strict rhythm and is a little bit free form, but it's poetry that's written to be performed out loud, as opposed to poetry that's written down and just read off the page. And so there's a long tradition of spoken word and different sort of forms and variations, and I really got into slam poetry, which tends to be quite fast and loud sometimes, and has a lot of rhyme and metaphor, and borrows a little bit from the hip-hop tradition. So I rap a little bit with a band called Riverbased, and then I also perform some spoken word as a solo artist. And as well as that, I play sax as well. So
it's a saxophone.
Yeah, sax. I originally started on clarinet back in school, and both clarinet and tenor sax these days. I play a bit of both.
Interesting, I will research that.
Yeah. You can look up the Mouldy Lovers. That's my ska punk band.
Okay, we'll do that. You and your partner live on a houseboat in Brisbane.
Yeah.
Why a houseboat? Why not an apartment nice and high overlooking Brisbane? And the reason I'm asking this question is because I am absolutely staggered by the figures quoted on your website about the vacancy of buildings, offices, apartment blocks, new and old, and vacant land that is not being built on.
Yeah.
So please tell us and our public what this is about, and where are you with your proposal of a vacancy level? What does it all mean, please?
Yeah, so I mean, housing policy is a really big, complex issue, and as I'm sure many of your viewers and listeners would realise, housing is getting very expensive in cities like Brisbane. Lots of people have been priced out. They can't afford to buy a place of their own, and so then they're living as renters, often with very high rent and in conditions where you don't have much stability. So people are worried that their lease won't be renewed and that they'll have to move house every 6 months or 12 months. Maybe your landlord won't let you make minor changes to the property. We've heard lots of stories of people who they can't even get permission to put up shelves, or little things like that. And so that was part of what led to me and my partner living on a houseboat, because we couldn't afford to buy our place of our own, but we didn't want a landlord, taking lots of money off us and not giving us much stability. So before we moved into the houseboat, we'd been living in rental share houses, which was nice, but I think there was a period there where in 5 years we had to move 5 times. Every year the rent would go up, or the landlord would want to renovate or would kick us out or whatever, not because we were bad tenants, but just because that's the way the housing market works. And that really is part of what I'm talking about as a politician, and particularly with regards to issues like the vacancy levy, where there are thousands of empty residential properties, commercial properties, and blocks of land in Brisbane. And we're continually told that we should just let the private sector do whatever it wants with housing and leave housing up to the private market. But because of the way our tax system is structured and the way that property values are continually rising, there are a lot of property investors out there who they don't even want to get tenants in. They just leave the property empty and wait for the value to rise. So it's counterintuitive in a way, but if you think about it from an investor's point of view, if they're waiting for the perfect time to sell, it's easier for them to have the property empty. So they could keep a tenant in and maybe they'll make $10,000 or $20,000 a year in rent, depending on what they're charging. But instead of that $10,000 or $20,000 a year in rent, if they've got the flexibility to sell just when they want to sell, that might be worth $50,000 or $100,000 in terms of the price difference. So the way the market works incentivizes investors to leave properties empty rather than rent them out cheaply. And so that's part of why we have a housing crisis. It's not the full picture, but yeah, it's a big issue. But living on a houseboat's been really nice. It's for us, it's also been nice to feel a little bit closer to nature and to also be able to experiment with more sustainable ways of living. So as a renter, we would never have the option of solar power, whereas on the houseboat, we've been able to put our own solar panels on. We're catching rainwater, we're recycling grey water, we're even composting our own poo, actually. And so we turn that into soil that goes into our pot plants. So it's also been a way, because we have more control over our housing situation, we can live a bit more sustainably, and that's been nice.
And just a side question to all those empty buildings, why we have such a huge number of homeless people in Brisbane? Why aren't they not being housed?
Exactly, yeah. So fundamentally, homelessness is a result of housing being treated as a commodity. Housing should be a basic human right. Everyone should be guaranteed access to housing. But because in Australia we've left housing primarily up to the private market, the interests of those private investors mean they just want to get as much money as possible. So people on lower incomes simply can't afford the rent. And that's been a gradual trend over many years where house prices have risen, homelessness has also risen. And so some of the ways we can change that are to scrap negative gearing and capital gains discount tax incentives. So at the federal level, there are a lot of incentives that encourage people to invest in property. And that means it can almost be easier to buy your third or fourth property than it is to buy your first property. And so a lot of young people get locked out of the housing market altogether. And then at the state government level, there hasn't been enough increase in the supply of public housing. So they've been building a lot of private sector housing, but what we really need is more public housing. And if you go to countries like Holland, in fact, you'll find there's a lot more public housing. And many European countries, the governments take a much more proactive role in actually providing a lot of public housing, whereas Australia has been going down more like the US route, where they don't provide much public housing and they leave it up to the private sector. And that's ultimately why we have this problem of homelessness.
Right, so that's the difference, yes. Like you're saying, I was born in Holland, grew up in Belgium. The housing, yes, it's all publicly owned. Yes. Very good. What is your approach to supporting small businesses here in Wollongabba? COVID has done so much bad stuff for and given hardship to a lot of the businesses. Are you working on that project? Yeah,
and what we tend to see in the way governments respond to crises is that they make policy responses that tend to favour really big corporations. So a lot of the incentives will be easier for those really big businesses to access, whereas for a small business, there tends to be a lot more bureaucracy, a lot more regulation. So in order to get any support from government, they have to jump through a lot of hoops. And we're particularly seeing that in terms of smaller hospitality businesses. So there are really large bars and clubs which are able to operate, they've changed some of the rules and restrictions, but they're still able to make a profit. Whereas a much smaller restaurant or a smaller cafe or a smaller music venue, if they, for example, have a gathering limit of 1 person per 4 square metres, they can only fit a few people in the venue. And so we as the Greens have been arguing that those square meterage rules should be changed. And just recently, we've finally seen the Queensland government respond. And I think now the rules have changed to you can have one person for every 2 square metres, which is a little bit better. But I think what that highlights is that the government introduced a one-size-fits-all rule that applied to everything from a 1,000-person mega club to a small cafe.
Yes.
And
it
I
doesn't
think,
work.
yeah, and really, when you think about it objectively, the risks of virus transmission are much greater for those very large venues than for a much smaller venue. So you would think you might be able to have slightly different rules. But we see the same bias against small business in terms of transport planning. So for example, a larger business like a Woolworths or a shopping centre or maybe a Bunnings warehouse, their business model depends on people driving from many kilometres away. So a very dispersed customer base. A local small business, like a small hardware shop or a deli or a local greengrocer, most of their customers only live within a few hundred metres, and maybe they walk or ride, and they're less likely to drive long distances. But at all levels of government, particularly council, the state government, and also the federal government, a lot of money is invested in widening roads and widening intersections to carry more cars longer distances. And so that effectively operates as a hidden subsidy against small business in favour of those bigger businesses. Because a Bunnings or an IKEA or any of these larger chain stores, they wouldn't be commercially viable except that the government is building bigger and bigger roads to carry people there. And again, if you look at a lot of European cities, they have smaller, narrower roads. They don't always spend as big money on intersection widening and highway widening. And as a result, more people still shop locally. And so I think actually it seems like a bit of a disconnection, but the way that government invests money in transport and continues to prioritise cars ahead of pedestrian crossings and bike lanes, etc., is also a bit of a bias against local small businesses in favour of those big businesses. And so that's something else I advocate on.
We're going to those bike lanes now.
Yeah, right.
Many Australians enjoy cycling because it improves their health and reduces road congestion and air pollution. And there is a common perception that riding a bike is a dangerous activity. Cycling is less popular in Australia than in Europe, and in the Netherlands, where I come from, there are about 23 million bikes compared to 3.4 million here in Australia.
Yeah, right.
And the bike path infrastructure in the Netherlands and in Belgium is staggering. Staggering. I have not driven a bike here in Australia.
You don't feel safe here? Yeah.
No, I've been here 40 years next month,
right.
and I have not been on a push bike. Where are you with the project to have separate bike lanes developed in and around Brisbane to safeguard all our people and our children on the road?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so this is something that the Greens have been pushing for a long time, and particularly since I got elected in 2016, we've made a point of really advocating for more separated cycling infrastructure, and we've had some wins. So for example, in my electorate of Wollongabba, there are new bike lanes that have gone in along Stanley Street, and they're fully separated. You're not sharing a narrow path with pedestrians, and you're also not sharing with fast-moving cars. And just recently, we've also got new bike lanes installed along Elizabeth Street in the CBD. And so there have been a few projects, bit by bit, here and there, that have had a positive impact, but they're still not fully connected up. And so it's all well and good to have this world-class bike lane on one stretch of Wollongabba, but as soon as you get to the end of it, it just stops and you can't get anywhere. And so I think a lot of it is really about fixing those missing links. And part of what has to happen is that we actually have to be willing to take away a little bit of street parking. That's how you create the room, because in a built-up city, the buildings are already up to the footpath edge. If you want the space for bike lanes, you have to sometimes take away a lane of general traffic, or you have to take away some street parking. And that's politically really difficult. And so I've kind of been pushing that idea. The Labor and Liberal parties are still a bit resistant to it because they know that it can be politically unpopular to take away parking, and particularly in the city. So everyone has trouble parking. But I guess the message is that if we make it easier for people to walk and ride, they won't have to drive, and then there'll be less demand for parking. So particularly I think one piece of the conversation that gets left out around bike lanes is around the independence of children. So in Australia, often mum and dad are almost like taxi drivers. They have to drive their kids everywhere because they don't feel safe letting their kids travel around by themselves. Whereas if we have safer pedestrian crossings, lower speed limits, and safe separated bike lanes, kids can travel to sport or to school or to their friends' houses without having to be driven, and that actually frees up more time for the parents and also gives the kids a bit more independence and autonomy, and that I think is really important. So yeah, pushing for more bike lanes is really important to me. One of the big projects I'm pushing at the moment is separated bike lanes along Vulture Street, which would connect West End through to Woolloongabba, because we've got this great bike lane in Woolloongabba that gets you to the end of Stanley Street and the Mater Hospital, and from there, if you're trying to get into West End, there's nothing. So fixing that missing link is really important. And I'm excited about that because my electorate of West End and Woolloongabba, this area already has a lot of people who are really interested in cycling. And there's also now way more people using e-scooters.
That's right.
And that's causing a bit of conflict because pedestrians don't like sharing those narrow footpaths with fast-moving e-scooters.
They're too fast.
Exactly. Yeah. And we do hear stories of people getting hit by them and people don't feel safe. So the logical solution is to create those separated bike lanes, and then the e-scooters are in a safe space as well.
There was a question here, your approach to working with community members who are not happy about the new footbridge. Are we talking the Neville Bonner Bridge?
There's a few bridges at the moment under construction, and the Neville Bonner Bridge is the footbridge over to the casino in the Queen's Wharf.
It's fantastic.
Yeah.
It connects the city to South Bank, to all the entertainment and stuff.
Yeah, so I was a little bit critical of that bridge for a couple of reasons. The first,
So you were critical of
I was, and one of the reasons I was critical is that it's not accessible to bicycles, and it's not going to be fully compliant in terms of wheelchair access. It's going to be quite a steep bridge. And part of the critique of the Queen's Wharf casino development was that it's happening on public land on the north bank of the river. Now, we argued that public land should instead have been turned into public parkland, kind of like South Bank. So we've got the lovely South Bank parklands on the southern side. We could have had a similar approach on the north side. Instead, the state government sold off that land to the casino developers very cheaply, and in exchange they said, oh look, we're getting this bridge. So it was kind of like the bridge was the trade-off for the privatising that public land. The other concern we have with that particular bridge is that it doesn't connect from one side of the river to the other. It connects from South Bank directly to the casino. So it's kind of like sucking members of the public into this hub of gambling and consumerism. And I guess the broader concern was simply that we already have the Goodwill Bridge a little bit further along, and then immediately in the other direction is the Victoria Bridge. So of all the places along the river, that was probably not the best place for a new bridge. And what we've been advocating for is that we actually need a bridge from West End to Toowong. And there are a few other spots along the river where we've been saying are a higher priority. And just recently, we've had Brisbane City Council come on board, and the major parties have said they'll also support a bridge from West End to Toowong. Excellent. So that's really great. And we've also got funding and support secured for a bridge from Kangaroo Point to the CBD. So that'll be a really good one. You'll be able to get directly from near where BMAC and the radio station and everything is directly over to the CBD. So that's coming soon as well. And I think construction on the Kangaroo Point Bridge is due to begin in a few months. So,
oh, fantastic.
Yeah, so that'll be really good.
That's good for us.
Yeah.
Yes. All right, from the bridge we go to the ferry network upgrade. I love travelling on the Brisbane River and do it several times a week. And every time I step on a city cat or a kitty cat or a hopper, I feel I'm on a cruise.
Yeah, it's wonderful.
Beautiful city. Have you got an update for us as to more ferries, more ferry terminals, less ferry terminals?
Yeah, so it seems like Brisbane City Council and the state government are locked in a bit of an argument over how important river-based public transport is and how much money should go into it. Because I think that everyone can see that ferries are a great thing and they're a fun way to move people around. They're also expensive and no one wants to pay for them. And so my argument is that if we put more public money into subsidised public transport like ferries, more people will use it and that'll help address traffic congestion. So I think we should have more terminals, more ferry services, in particular because in my electorate I've been arguing for a new ferry terminal on the western side of West End because we've had about 10,000 people move into that area around Montague Road and Davies Park. And right now there's not good public transport in and out of that area. So we think we need a new terminal there. And we're also arguing for the restoration of the ferry terminal at Dockside.
Dockside, please bring it back.
Which was a big issue because a lot of people relied on that ferry terminal to get around, not just to get to the city, but to get along other parts of the river. and the council shut down that terminal at short notice on the basis that they needed to renovate it. And the council said, well, we need to bring it up to disability compliant standards. But they didn't plan ahead properly. They've known about this issue for years. They've known it wasn't compliant with disability standards. And so they waited and waited and waited, and then finally, without warning, they shut it down. So that's been really disappointing. The council said that they're going to restore the terminal and they've allocated the money to rebuild it, but they're still saying it could be a year or two away. And so obviously that's really disappointing. In the meantime, we're arguing that City Cats should instead stop at Holman Street, just nearby on Kangaroo Point, so that at least all those residents who live on Kangaroo Point have some access to better services. Long term, I think there's going to be an interesting debate in the city because some, particularly businesses and some of the people in the Liberal Party, they want to support more private river-based transport. But I would argue that the priority should be public transport, because if you privatise too much of that, you'll have lots of water taxis and private vessels ducking back and forth. That'll cause congestion on the river and then make the City Cats less efficient. So yeah, it's an interesting time in the city in terms of what is the role of transport on the river? Is it just for tourists, or is it actually going to be a good way for people to get around? So
a fantastic way for people to get around.
Exactly.
Now we're heading towards 2032, the Olympic Games, and part of the sports are going to happen at the Gabba here.
Yeah.
I read about a $1 billion rebuild. It's a humongous amount of money. But the fact that lots of sporting venues around Brisbane and Queensland are going to be renovated, they're not going to build new ones. Where are you sitting in this project, and how will that impact us here in Brisbane?
Yeah, so I was, out of 26 city councillors in Brisbane, I was the only councillor who voted against hosting the Olympics. I argued that it wasn't actually as good an economic proposition as some of the marketing suggests, because although there's a lot of propaganda that says the Olympics generates an economic benefit, the host city always spends a huge amount of money on infrastructure and sports facilities, but also the costs of maintenance and handling a massive influx of people, the construction impacts. When you add it all up, the independent economic analyses that have been conducted on every games from the last 50 years finds that it's not a good idea to host. Of course, Brisbane has ended up hosting, or the preferred host for 2032. And the main reason for that is that no other cities really wanted it. There were a few other cities that said, oh, maybe we'd like to host. But Brisbane was the only city to put in a serious bid to host the Olympics. And so we kind of got it by default, because it's getting more and more expensive to host the Olympics, and fewer cities were interested in hosting. One, I guess, positive thing that's come out of that conversation is that there's slightly a stronger focus on reusing existing venues rather than on building brand new facilities. And I think that was one of the biggest critiques of Olympics, like the Rio Olympics, even the London Olympics, spending huge amounts of money building new stadiums that otherwise the city doesn't need. So that idea is good, but what we see now, that although they're reusing existing facilities, they're still spending a huge amount of money refurbishing them. And they're planning to spend $1 billion upgrading the Gabba Stadium, which is essentially rebuilding the whole thing. It's almost like you might as well have built a new stadium. And I guess what's particularly disappointing about that is that actually we have another stadium, the QE2 Stadium, just a bit further south towards Mount Gravatt. And it was used for the Commonwealth Games when Brisbane hosted the Games in the 80s. And it would be cheaper to restore and is pretty close to competition level standard for the Olympics. And so some people are asking, well, why couldn't we use the QE2 Stadium instead? And actually one of the main reasons seems to be that it doesn't have as good public transport. So I would have said, well, why not spend $1 billion improving public transport to the existing stadium rather than spending money rebuilding the Gabba Stadium? What's, I think, particularly disappointing about the current planning for the Olympics is that there's no strong plan to deliver public housing. So they're building a big new athletes village at Hamilton. That's their current plan. And you would think, logically, use it as an athletes village and then turn it into public housing. That would make a lot of sense. But it looks like they're going to be privatising that land, asking private developers to build the athletes village and then converting it to private housing afterwards. So that's a phenomenal missed opportunity, but it's not too late. And I think the people of Brisbane, if we're concerned about homelessness, if we're concerned about rising house prices, we should be asking, why isn't the athletes village going to be genuine public housing? not this sort of propaganda affordable housing or this tokenistic talk about social housing that's slightly cheaper. It needs to be genuine public housing that's affordable for people on low incomes.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, indeed. You have been in this role since 2016. So tell me about the top 3 areas that you have focused on and what have you achieved for us as the community?
Yeah, I think one issue we've focused on with a lot of success is changing expectations and norms about how decisions should be made. So whatever your specific issue is, whether it's transport planning or development or park upgrades or whatever, a fundamental frustration residents have is that they feel like they don't have enough say over how their neighbourhood changes.
You're not listening to me.
You don't get a say when they shut down the ferry terminal or whatever. And so what we've been trying to do is introduce this idea of participatory democracy. Participatory democracy is where local people who have an interest in an issue actually have a meaningful say, not just by filling out a survey and crossing your fingers that the government listens, but actually participating in meetings and forums and discussion spaces where the decisions are actually made. So we've been trialling that system for local park upgrades. As a local councillor, I don't have control over the entire city budget or a lot of the big project decisions, but I do have a little bit of control over how the local park upgrades budget is spent. And so we've been using community voting and participatory budgeting to give residents more control. And now we've started to use similar styles of community voting for other local decisions. And I think in a way that's one of the achievements I'm proudest of, is that we've reintroduced this idea of direct democracy rather than representative democracy, where you just vote once every 4 years and hope they do something. I think the other shift that I've been really involved in is around social justice and housing. And I think a few years ago, it was perhaps taken for granted that it's all right to leave housing up to the private sector. And very few people were talking about public housing as a good thing. Public housing had this strong stigma attached to it. People say, oh, I don't want to live near public housing. We don't want public housing in our neighbourhood. Whereas myself and the Greens have put a lot of time and energy into saying, no, public housing is important and housing justice is important. We shouldn't just leave housing up to the private sector. And I've been able to support a few positive developments, such as projects by Brisbane Housing Company, where they've been delivering some affordable housing in the inner city, which is good. And I've also, on a related note, advocated strongly against moving homeless people out of public spaces. And you'll notice a difference actually. There are some parts of the city where homeless people, and particularly Aboriginal people, get moved on very quickly if they're hanging out in a park or on a street. Whereas if you go to a place like West End, you'll see that people of all demographics and income levels are hanging out in public parks and spaces without getting hassled and moved on. And I think I've had a bit of a role to play in that, because I've been saying to council and the police, no, these people deserve to be able to use these public spaces. And in fact, it's often racist and classist to be targeting these people and moving them on. So that's been an interesting one. And then of course, we've done a lot of advocacy around active transport and bike lanes, which we talked about.
Yes, you did. So what upcoming priorities will you be focusing on in the near future?
Yeah, so we're continuing to organise a little bit around renters' rights in particular, and I've been supporting a new union. It's called the South East Queensland Union of Renters. I'm not running the project, I'm just sort of one of many people supporting it. And the idea there is to build a collective alliance of renters who can support each other when landlords and real estate agents are exploiting them. So my office is going to be doing a bit of work in that space as well. We've already started naming and shaming real estate agents who behave particularly badly. So not all landlords and agents are bad, but there are some real estate agents who treat their tenants very poorly, and we've started publicly naming them and saying, don't rent from this guy. So that's been interesting. We're also continuing to do a bit of advocacy around Deebing Creek, and that's well outside of inner Brisbane. That's a development site just south of Ipswich, but it's currently a forested area, native bushland and a creek running through it that actually connects to the Brisbane River. And that's the site of a historical Aboriginal mission and is very important to a lot of Aboriginal people. But developers now want to bulldoze the forest and force the Aboriginal people off their land. And so we've been supporting those people. And I think that's particularly important because sometimes I say no to certain development projects in the inner city, and I object to projects which I don't think are sustainable or are going to improve housing affordability. But equally, I think it's important to object to those outer suburban developments like Deebing Creek, because they're bulldozing the forest and widening roads and all that sort of stuff. So even though it's not in my electorate, I think we need to pay attention to those issues as well. And so if anyone's interested, you can look up Deebing Creek, and there are many ways to support the Aboriginal people on site who are actually doing amazing work, restoring the forest, planting gardens, and turning that site into a cultural hub. And that's what's so inspiring, is that they're not just signing petitions and saying, oh, we don't want this development. They're camping on site. They've built housing on site and they're living there. And so that's quite inspiring.
Last question. Are there any other subjects that you would like to address in this interview?
Yeah, I guess one thing that still interests me, and it comes back to that idea of participatory democracy, is who gets a say in our democracy? And right now in Brisbane and in fact Australia, we have lots of people who've lived here a long time, they work hard, they pay tax, but because they're not citizens, they don't get the right to vote, and they're often excluded from conversations about the future of our city. So there are thousands of asylum seekers who live in Brisbane. They're on bridging visas or short-term temporary visas. They've been here long-term. Some people have lived here 10 years. They still don't get citizenship, but they're paying tax. They're contributing to society. And I think that's a real gap. And similarly, if we think about the way First Nations peoples are treated, they are the rightful owners of this land, but they have so little control over the decisions that shape our country. And so I think as a society, we need to be paying more attention and actually uplifting the voices of First Nations peoples and responding, not just listening to them, but actually doing what they're asking. And so I still think systemic racism is a big problem in Australia. I think we see a lot of discrimination against new migrants and against First Nations peoples. And for me, I'm quite passionate about thinking about how we can challenge that as well.
That was lovely. Thank you for your time today.
Thank you so much. It's been such a pleasure to be part of this discussion.